Today I want to introduce to you three important topics in political theory: authority, legitimacy, and justice. And I'm going to do that using Plato's dialogue, the Crito. So in the Crito, Socrates has been found guilty and sentenced to death. His friend, Crito, has organized a jailbreak for him and has a ship waiting to take him into exile. Socrates, however, and this is perhaps not surprising given what we know about Socrates, refuses to escape. Now, Socrates agrees with Crito that the sentence that he's received is unjust, but he argues that he has to stay and accept his fate. In fact, he says, justice demands it. Now, why is it that justice demands that Socrates submit to injustice? How does this make any sense? So first of all, let's define justice loosely for now. Let's say that justice means doing the right thing, whatever that is. So I say, insert your favorite conception of what is right here. It doesn't matter very much what you think justice is at this point. Let's just say that justice is doing the right thing. Now, there's an important distinction here to be drawn between doing the right thing on the one hand and having a right to do something on the other hand. Let's look over a couple different examples. I have a right to get married. That doesn't mean that it's right that I get married to any particular person. I have the right to have children. That doesn't necessarily make it right for me to have children at any given point in time in my life. I have a right to free speech, but that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do to say whatever I'm thinking or whatever I feel like at any given time. So this distinction turns out to be pretty important for political theory as well. Socrates is saying that Athens may have been wrong to condemn him, that is to say, they've done him an injustice, but Athens may have still had the right to condemn him nonetheless, establishing a distinction here between what is just on the one hand and then what is perhaps better called legitimate on the other hand. Now, political legitimacy, at least in political theory, means having the right to rule. More specifically, it's the right to enforce one's commands on other people. Now, this is actually distinct from the word legitimacy as you might have learned it in other courses in social science. Maybe you've covered the concept in sociology, maybe you covered it in Intro to American Government. There, political legitimacy means that the people, in fact, agree that the government has the right to rule. And when the people think the government has the right to rule, in social science, that's as good a saying as it does. But in philosophy, we're always open to the possibility that people are, in fact, mistaken. Maybe the people are wrong about whether the government has the right to rule. And that's pretty easy to come up with examples where the people may simply be misinformed about what the government is doing, and so they think the government has the right to do what they have to do, or what they're doing, rather, but in fact they don't. Now, what Socrates is saying, for reasons we're going to talk about in a minute, that Athens has in fact the right to enforce its rules, its laws, and that includes condemning him to death, even when Athens is wrong to do so. But if you think about it for a minute, he's actually saying more than that. He's also saying that Athens has the right to create duties for him. He's saying that political obligations towards Athens derive from his status as citizen of Athens. In other words, Athens doesn't just have the right to enforce its laws through coercion, but it also has the right to create moral duties for him, and presumably for all citizens, or at least some of its citizens. Right, because if Athens only had the right to enforce its laws, then Socrates could take Crito's offer, right? Athens' legitimacy only affects what Athens has the right to do. Athens has the right to enforce the law. Athens' legitimacy doesn't yet say anything about what Socrates has a right to do. But if Athens has authority, that is to say, if Athens can create duties for Socrates, then, of course, Athens can in fact affect what Socrates has a right to do. And what Socrates is claiming is that he has a political obligation to stay there and be executed rather than to flee. So, in sum, in addition to having the legitimate right to enforce its laws on Socrates, that is to say, the right to throw him in jail, Athens also has authority over Socrates, the right to create obligations for Socrates to, in fact, submit to his punishment. Okay, I said I'd bracket the question, what can give a government authority and legitimacy. So let's talk about that for a minute. Socrates gives one answer to this question, and the answer, generally speaking in philosophy, revolves around the idea of reciprocity. Reciprocity here is a term that's used to describe moral obligations that come from when you receive benefits from someone. So, for example, if someone does you a favor one time, that means you owe them, right? You owe them a favor. And Socrates is saying, in fact, that he owes Athens because Athens gave him lots of favors. Athens, in fact, made him into who he is today. Athens educated him, gave him laws that kept him safe and free throughout his long life. And so Socrates feels like he owes Athens the duty to obey its commands because of everything that Athens did for him. To flee now, Socrates thinks, would be kind of like renouncing your parents just because you disagreed with them about curfew or being grounded or something. Just because the rules don't work in your favor doesn't mean that you still don't have to obey them. He also gives a second answer, which might be called something like implied consent. As a free man, Socrates could have left Athens any time during his long life. He could have gotten involved in politics to change the laws. He could have done lots of things to challenge, to suggest that he didn't agree with the laws of Athens. But, in fact, Socrates stayed in Athens throughout his life, and he didn't get involved in politics. And so that suggests that his behavior implied, right, logically implied, that he had no problem with those laws, that he, in fact, consented to those laws. Most people think that if you consent to rules, you become obligated to follow them. So, for example, if you play cards with your friends for M&Ms, and let's assume there's a fair card game, no one's cheating, it seems like if you lose at the game, you're obligated to surrender your M&Ms, however many you lost. Similarly, if you voluntarily crossed a border into a foreign country, you're implying that you're agreeing to obey its laws, right? You're implying, if you cross the border, that you accept all the rules and regulations that come with being in that country. Similarly, Socrates is saying his presence in Athens, his refusal to leave Athens, is just as if is the same thing as having consented to the laws of Athens. If he was unhappy, after all, he was free to leave any time. And so, as a result, because he consented to the rules, he's obligated to play by the rules and to abide by them, even when they do him wrong. Okay, now, these points aren't uncontroversial, so let me go over some objections. These aren't the only objections. There's lots of objections that could be leveled at both of Socrates' defense, but here's a couple. Here's one that Crito has. Crito says, look, Athens has treated you unjustly. In some sense, they violated their duties of reciprocity to you first. Socrates, you served in the army, you're a veteran, you raised your children in Athens, you were a loyal, for the most part, law-abiding citizen of Athens. You may have been in a relationship of reciprocity, but Athens violated those duties first, right? And because they violated their duties, your duties have therefore lapsed. There's an analogy here. If you have a duty not to hit people, that's true, but if someone hits you, it seems like you have a permission to hit back. After all, they started it, right? Now, Socrates has a response to Crito. Socrates says, look, I have a duty to be just. That's my duty. It doesn't really matter if other people are behaving unjustly. I still have to do my duty, regardless of what other people are doing. The fact that others are doing it too, or others are doing it, isn't any excuse for me to do what I'm doing. So, in words that a 5-year-old could understand, right? 2 wrongs don't make a right, is Socrates' response to this. A second objection, or at least, and this is a potential objection, it's not one that Crito actually has, but it's one that I think is fairly intuitive, is that, look, in the case of the card game, you have the duty to play by the rules of the game. And if it's a fair game, then yes, you are obviously obligated to abide by the result, whatever the result happens to be. But what you definitely didn't agree to, right, what you didn't consent to, was play a rigged game, right, a game that was unfair. And you might say, look, this trial was unfair. These charges were trumped up. It sounds like some of the jurors might have been bribed in some way. Socrates, again, because he wasn't given this objection, we can only guess at what he would have said. But it sounds like he would have said something like the following. 1, it's not up to me to decide that the trial was unfair. Every criminal loves to claim that the trial was unfair and rigged against him, but that doesn't make them not criminals. 2, How was the trial unfair? He was given every opportunity to defend himself. The vote was, after all, pretty close. What in the world makes you think that it was rigged? A third objection, and this is another potential objection, not one that Crito actually levels, he could come back and say, look, but this is your life we're talking about, Socrates. We're not talking about losing a few minae at card games, right? Reciprocity loses its meaning after death, right? We're talking about an exchange of favors. Well, when one party to the exchange dies, there's no future exchange of favors. There's no expectation of future reciprocity. And so, surely, reciprocity lapses when it requires you to die. And not only that, but there's probably things you just can't consent to, right? Not because it's impossible to say yes to them, but because, morally speaking, they are repugnant, or they go beyond what any individual person can, in fact, morally consent to, such as their own murder. Socrates' response, and he has an actual response, he sort of anticipates this objection. He says, look, what's truly precious to a man isn't his life, it's his integrity. Lots of things can happen to him, right? Accidents, disease, bad laws in this case, they can all take away his life, but only an individual himself can compromise his integrity. So what matters here is not whether I can die or not, everybody dies, but what matters is that I keep my integrity. That's what ultimately I have. It's the only thing I own. And he doesn't think that he can flee and still maintain his integrity. Moreover, and this is not something he actually said, but something you might imagining him saying, he said, look, I didn't consent to my own murder. I consented to rules that I knew very well, if I violated them, could lead to my execution. So unless you think that capital punishment by definition is never permissible, right, it's never allowable, I don't see how I can object to its application in my case, right? If I think it's okay in general, and if it's okay for laws to punish me through capital punishment, or punish anyone through capital punishment, then it's okay to punish me. In that sense, he's saying, look, what applies to everyone should also apply to me. So clearly there's more objections here that could be said in favor of and against Socrates. For example, it's not clear to me that the only thing that residing in a city could imply is consent to the laws. It may be that they just never thought about it. It's unlikely in Socrates' case, but implied consent, lots of things could be implied by one staying in a city, and not all of them have to do with obeying the laws. But it's important to note here that Socrates is really actively opposing Crito's more consequentialist thinking. And he's opposing this consequentialist thinking with a mix of deontological and virtue ethics type arguments, right? Arguments having to do with his duty and his integrity. So for example, Crito says, look, think of your children, think of your friends, and the consequences that your death will have on them. Also think of the consequence of your reputation, how it will be ruined because you chose death rather than to escape. Socrates says, look, I'm old, all people are going to die sooner or later, so the fact that my children will be harmed now rather than harmed later doesn't really seem to be an important consideration. He says, look, what really matters is my integrity, my character, my virtue. Plus, my reputation, he says, is based on the thoughts and the feelings of uneducated and misinformed people. Trying to please those people is a foolish quest, right? It's no virtue to chase after the approval of people who don't have good judgment. And so, all I can do, Socrates says, is to be a just person. The consequences aren't really under my control, but my character is definitely under my control. Alright, let me give you some final thoughts before I sign off. Socrates uses the word justice in a slightly different way than we do today. He's really talking about the just person. He's not talking about just actions. He's really not talking about the just society. The just person for Socrates isn't the person who follows just rules, right? He isn't the person who plays by the rules that happen to be just. For him, the just person is a person with a virtuous character, who knows how to balance obligations and duties that he has, who knows how to exercise his rights. That person is a just person. Now, you guys have to decide for yourselves whether you think that's in fact what justice is. On the one hand, it's not a very political idea of justice, right? For Socrates, a just society is basically a society full of just people, of people who exercise their virtues justly. It's not a society that has good laws or just laws. For Socrates, just laws are laws that tend to make people more just, not laws that punish people for doing bad things necessarily. So laws that enable people to exercise their virtues better. And of course, exercising your virtues requires a certain amount of freedom, because if you're forced to do the right thing, you're not doing it for the right reasons. You're doing it because you're forced to do it. So it's not a very political conception of justice. On the other hand, it's kind of empowering. On Socrates' view, no one can take justice away from you without your consent. No one can do you an injustice, right, without you consenting to it in some way, because the only injustice is losing your integrity. The only thing that can harm you is yourself, in a sense. Because, the consequences are out of your control. The consequences matter a whole lot less for Socrates. Or at least on this view of justice, consequences matter less. You can still be good, in other words, even in a flawed society.